There's something about the early Nancy Guthrie investigation that I believe has been misunderstood. For months, we've looked at the surveillance footage released by the FBI, believing that investigators probably have a much longer recording that just simply hasn't been made public yet. But, the FBI Director Kash Patel's comments, over the past few months give us another way to understand what may have happened here. The footage that we've seen may represent portions of what investigators were actually able to recover from Google's back-end systems. And according to Patel, getting the FBI fully involved earlier may have allowed investigators to recover much more.
They found the footage. Then they lost the story that came with it. And nobody in law enforcement wants to explain why. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She has mobility limitations.
I'm interested in getting answers because we're approaching 7 months since 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home. Nancy was a woman with mobility limitations and serious health concerns. And nearly 7 months later, there has been no publicly identified suspect, no publicly identified suspect vehicle, and no publicly announced DNA identification that has led investigators to the person responsible. And we've learned that there is a serious disagreement between the director of the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff over what may have happened during some of the most critical early days of this investigation. And listen, that all matters. It matters because we're not talking about politics here. We're talking about Nancy. We're talking about a mother and a grandmother who was taken from her home in the middle of the night, and there still hasn't been any answers. And Nancy,
serious health concerns. She was taken from her own home in the middle of the night, and almost 7 months later, there's still no suspect. No vehicle. No DNA match announced to the public. Just a masked figure on a porch camera and 2 law enforcement officials who can't agree on what actually happened during the first 4 days investigators had to work with. And look, you already know how this goes. You've seen it before. A missing woman. An agency turf war. And somewhere in the middle of it, actual evidence. Real evidence that could bring someone home, quietly slipping through the cracks while grown men in suits argue about who said what to whom. Here's the thing, though. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is Kash Patel, the FBI director himself, on the record, saying the FBI was kept out of this investigation for 4 days.
And when the director of the FBI publicly says that his agency was kept out for 4 days, while the local sheriff says that the FBI task force personnel were involved from the very beginning. And I believe that this deserves a closer look, not to attack anybody and not to sensationalize Nancy's disappearance, and certainly not to pretend that we know everything happening behind the scenes, because, we do not. Nancy Guthrie, she deserves answers. Her family deserves answers. And after nearly 7 months, coming up on 7 months.
And this is Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, pushing back, saying that's not true, that a federal task force member was there from the start. 2 law enforcement officials. 2 completely different stories. And somewhere between those 2 stories is Nancy Guthrie, still missing, still waiting. We already knew the justice system doesn't move for regular people the way it moves for headlines. You knew it. I knew it. But this case, this one's different because the disagreement isn't happening behind closed doors anymore. It's happening in public, in statements, in interviews, and it's happening because the evidence that eventually got recovered turned out to matter more than anyone expected. Nancy had a Nest doorbell camera. It was mounted right at her front door. It should have been the easiest witness in this entire case. But she reportedly didn't have the subscription needed to preserve a full continuous recording. So when investigators went looking, there wasn't a tape sitting there waiting for them. There was a recovery problem, a digital one. And digital evidence, here's what they don't want you thinking too hard about. Digital evidence doesn't sit patiently in an evidence locker like a knife or a shell casing.
Okay, Nancy, and we have been through the timeline over and over again, but let me go through this with you because this is very important to get to where I'm wanting to take y'all today. Nancy Guthrie was reported missing on Sunday, February the 1st. Pima County Sheriff's personnel responded to her home and they began an investigation. We now know that one of the most valuable potential witnesses to what happened that night was mounted right there at Nancy's front door. We took a very close look at this last week. Her Nest camera. But investigators encountered a significant problem. The surveillance recordings were not simply sitting in Nancy's account waiting to be downloaded. Nancy reportedly did not have a subscription. It's necessary for the normal preservation of those recordings. And that meant that investigators, they couldn't just simply log into the account and retrieve a complete recording of everything that happened during the relevant period. And at that point, the surveillance evidence became a digital recovery problem. And that's an important distinction here because, the images that we eventually...
It expires. It gets overwritten. Once it's gone for good.
You document it and you preserve it. Digital evidence adds another complication because some digital information is just temporary. Systems overwrite information. Retention periods expire. Temporary files, they disappear. Back-end information can eventually be purged. And once that happens, investigators may not get another opportunity. Physical evidence can sometimes just sit properly preserved in an evidence room for decades. Technology improves. And years later, investigators, they can test that evidence again. We've seen cold cases solved exactly that way. Temporary digital evidence can be very different. Once it's permanently gone, there may be nothing left to test 5 years from now. That's why the timing of the Google involvement matters.
So somebody had to go get it. And that somebody ended up being Google. Now stay with me here, because this is the part that should make your stomach turn a little. The footage that the entire public has spent 6 months studying, the masked figure on Nancy's porch, his clothing, his build, the equipment on his belt, all of it wasn't pulled from a normal recording. It was recovered from residual data buried inside Google's backend systems.
That ultimately involved contacting Google. And Google engineers were able to locate residual information within the back-end systems, and they recovered images that otherwise appeared to be unavailable. Those images, they gave investigators porch guy. Now, this is one of the most important parts of this entire discussion. The individual that we've spent 6 months examining was apparently revealed through data that investigators initially couldn't retrieve through normal means. That recovery gave investigators the masked individual working on Nancy's porch, his clothing, the body type, his movements, his interaction with the camera, the foliage, that equipment that he appeared to be carrying, the gun holster, the gun. Other physical characteristics that, investigators and the public have studied ever since. We've studied a lot of it last week. That recovered material became one of the most recognizable pieces of evidence in the entire Nancy Guthrie investigation. And it came from residual back-end data.
Fragments, not a full tape. Fragments that FBI-assisted engineers managed to piece back together. That should stop you for a second. Because if that's what they were able to recover after the fact, what didn't survive long enough to be recovered at all? This is where Patel's comments get uncomfortable. He's saying that if the FBI had been brought in at full strength earlier, investigators might have pulled more. Maybe more images of the masked man. Maybe a vehicle. Maybe evidence from an earlier visit to the property. He's not saying those recordings definitely existed, He's being careful not to say that. But he's saying the clock was working against this investigation, and every day that passed without full federal resources was a day that data may have quietly disappeared for good.
Patel said that earlier FBI involvement may have allowed investigators to recover additional information. He has referenced, the possibility of additional images involving the masked individual. He has referenced, a possible vehicle. He has also discussed the possibility of evidence involving an earlier visit. And I'm being very careful with my wording here because Patel's comments do not establish that those specific recordings definitely existed. They do not prove that a vehicle was captured and subsequently lost. They do not prove that another person appeared on the deleted footage. And they certainly don't establish that, Pima County intentionally allowed evidence to disappear. But his statements, they do establish something worth discussing. Time was potentially affecting the amount of digital information available for recovery. And that's the investigative issue here.
Sheriff Nanos says that's not fair. His office says an FBI task force member was on scene from day one, working alongside his deputies. And technically, both of them might be telling a version of the truth. Because here's something a lot of people don't understand about how this actually works. Having a task force officer on scene isn't the same thing as the full weight of the FBI being activated.
This is where Sheriff Chris Nanos' response to Kash Patel becomes very important. Pima County has said that the FBI task force member was notified and was present at the scene working alongside their personnel. Now, that statement deserves to be included in this discussion because it establishes that there was a federal task force involvement at some level very early in the investigation. But there is an important law enforcement distinction here. Now, having someone associated with an FBI task force working at a scene, it doesn't necessarily mean that the FBI as an agency has been fully brought into the investigation. Local and state officers routinely serve on federal task force. They work alongside federal agencies and they develop relationships with federal investigators. They may work cases jointly, but the presence of a task force officer does not automatically mean that the entire resources of the FBI have been activated and made available to the primary investigating agency. Those are two different levels of involvement.
A task force member is a local or state officer with a federal badge attached. It doesn't automatically mean Quantico lit up and every resource got deployed. Those are two different levels of involvement entirely. And that specific gap, is exactly where this disagreement is living. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because the timeline actually tells its own story if you lay it out plainly. February 1st, Nancy is reported missing. Pima County starts working the case. A task force member is reportedly there. But her Nest footage can't just be pulled up like a normal recording. Then comes the disputed 4 days. By February 5th, the FBI publicly announces it's jointly investigating. At some point in there, Google gets pulled in. And on February 10th, the recovered footage, the one everybody's been studying frame by frame for 6 months, finally gets released. There's one date missing from all of it. The exact moment somebody first called Google and said we need to preserve and recover this data. That single timestamp would tell us almost everything. And it hasn't been made public. Not from the FBI.
Here's the part of the timeline that remains important to me. Nancy, she was reported missing on February the 1st. Pima County, they began investigating. Pima County says that FBI task force member was involved at the scene. Patel says that the FBI itself was not fully brought into the investigation for approximately 4 days. Now, by February the 5th, the FBI publicly announces that it is jointly investigating the disappearance with Pima County. At some point during this process, Google becomes involved in trying to recover Nancy's Nest data. And on February the 10th, the FBI releases the recovered surveillance material showing the masked individual. There is one piece of that timeline that I have not seen publicly established with enough precision for me to state it as a fact. The exact date and time Google was first contacted about preserving or recovering Nancy's Nest data. I'm not going to fill that blank in with speculation. That date needs to come from documentation or from one of the agencies that are involved, the FBI or the Pima County Sheriff's Office. Its absence from the publicly known timeline matters, though, because, the amount of recoverable data potentially depends upon time. And this is where this entire discussion connects the...
Not from Pima County. Nowhere. I need to be honest with you for a second, because this part actually gets to me. I've spent over 2 decades in law enforcement. I know what it feels like to stand in a house where someone's missing and realize the evidence you need is slipping away while you're still filling out paperwork. That feeling doesn't leave you. And thinking about an 84-year-old grandmother taken from her own home, while 2 agencies argue about jurisdiction instead of racing the clock together. That's the part one can't just narrate past like it's nothing. It's personal. It shouldn't be, but it is. Let's get back to it, though, because there's more here. People assume investigators must be sitting on a longer, complete version of that Nest recording, that there's some full tape being held back for legal reasons. And for months, honestly, that was my assumption too. But Patel's comments have made me a whole lot less confident about that assumption.
It's surrounding the camera disconnect. And naturally, many of us have assumed that investigators probably possess a longer version. Patel's comments have made me much more cautious about making that assumption. There may be absolutely additional video evidence that law enforcement has chosen not to release. Investigators routinely hold evidence back from the public. We all know this. But concerning Nancy's Nest camera specifically, another explanation now has to be considered in our analysis. The clip released by the FBI may represent portions of what Google was successfully able to recover. The original continuous digital record may not have been available by the time that the deeper recovery took place. That would help explain why the footage that we've received appears the way that it does. It doesn't prove it, but it gives us important context that, that we didn't have when these videos were originally released. This also affects how I view one of the most important periods in this entire timeline. At approximately 1:47 a.m., Nancy's doorbell camera disconnects. And then at approximately 2:12 a.m.
What if the footage the public saw isn't a trimmed-down version of something bigger? What if it's actually the ceiling of what was recoverable? What if the missing pieces aren't being withheld? What if they're just gone? Think about that 25-minute gap between when Nancy's doorbell disconnects and when activity picks back up again on the camera. 25 minutes. We've studied that window for months, assuming there's more footage out there somewhere. But if the recovery effort hit a wall, that gap might not be a secret.
Roughly 25 minutes. We've spent a lot of time analyzing that period because, significant activity could have occurred around Nancy's home during those minutes. The public does not have a continuous visual record showing us exactly what happened. Patel's comments indicate that investigators themselves may have faced limitations in reconstructing the complete surveillance record. That's different from saying that investigators don't know what happened. They have evidence that we don't. They have investigative information that hasn't been released yet, but it means we should stop treating the existence of a complete unreleased Nest recording as a given. We don't know that such a recording exists.
It might be a casualty, and here's why that should matter to you. Even if you've never thought about digital forensics for a single second in your life, it doesn't take 10 minutes of extra footage to crack a case wide open. Sometimes 3 seconds does it. A partial vehicle and frame, a body style, a color, a second figure walking past. One of those things changes everything. One of those things turns a stalled investigation into a named suspect.
A vehicle description can produce registrations. Registrations produce names. Names produce addresses. Addresses produce associates. Investigators, they can begin comparing those individuals against phone records and locations, criminal histories, and just worlds of other evidence. That's how one seemingly small piece of evidence begins building an investigative chain. So when Patel talks about potentially obtaining more information had federal resources been brought in sooner, I take that seriously from an investigative standpoint, not as proof that evidence was lost, as an explanation of what may have been at stake. I also want to make something clear about the disagreement between Patel and Nanos. The public conversation has made this sound like only one of them can possibly be telling the truth, and I don't think it's necessarily that simple. Pima County can accurately say that federal task force personnel were involved early, and Patel can still maintain the FBI as an agency wasn't given the level of access or involvement that he believes it should have received until several days later.
And if that evidence existed and didn't survive 4 contested days, that's not a technicality. That's the whole case. This is where it all connects. This is the moment everything clicks into place. A vulnerable, elderly woman is taken from her home. Her only real witness, a camera, isn't preserved the way it should be. 2 agencies spend the most critical window of the entire investigation disagreeing about who is actually doing what. And by the time everyone gets fully aligned, they're not collecting evidence anymore. They're trying to resurrect it from a server somewhere in California. We've seen this pattern play out again and again in this country. Not because the people on the ground don't care. Most of them do. But because the system itself, the bureaucracy, the jurisdiction lines, the who called who first arguments, they eat time. And time is the one thing missing persons cases can never get back. I'm not going to sit here and tell you Pima County destroyed evidence on purpose. The public record doesn't support that. I'm not going to tell you the FBI is hiding a secret uncut version of that footage either. The record doesn't support that claim yet. What the record does support is this. Getting the right resources in the door on day 1 instead of day 4 might have mattered. And somebody, somewhere, in a report we haven't seen yet, knows exactly when Google was first contacted. That answer exists. It's just not public. So here's where I land, and here's where I need you. Porch Guy is still unidentified. Nancy is still missing. And somewhere out there, somebody knows exactly who that masked figure is. They don't need better footage to recognize him. They need to stop staying quiet. So I'll ask you directly. If 2 federal and local agencies can't even agree on what happened during the 4 most critical days of this case, how much are we not being told about everything that came after? Tell me what you think happened during those 4 days. And keep Nancy Guthrie's name circulating, because somebody out there already knows the truth, and it's time they stop protecting it.